Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music, the show where we discuss the weird and wonderful world of albums that are, for whatever reason, weird and unusual. So sometimes we look at odd and peculiar albums that, they're understandable but just a little bit weird, and then sometimes we look at really incomprehensible things that are just, crazy. Anything goes. And today we're going to be looking at one of the most interesting sound art projects that's ever been conceived, at least in my opinion. Composed by a composer who found his own voice in the world of experimental expression. We are, of course, looking at Alvin Lucier's I Am Sitting in a Room, 1981 version.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear then are the natural, resonant frequencies of the room, articulated by speech. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of a physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have.
So if you know what this album is, then you know what weirdness we're going to be uncovering today in today's episode. And if you don't, then sit tight and learn something new maybe, it's entirely up to you. So firstly, who is Alvin Lucier? Well, Lucier is an American composer of experimental music and sound installations that mostly delve into the world of acoustic phenomena and auditory perception. And across his very vast career, Lucier has been involved in the development of many experimental compositions that generally push the boundaries of conventional forms of sound generation and also sound perception. So how the sounds are made, how the sounds are perceived. And his work does come across as very experimental. Obviously, of course, they are very weird processes. And yet there's usually this very peculiar human element to some or a lot of his projects that make them feel like more than just experiments, but like a real expression of Lucier's visions and creativity. And in his very vast discography, there's so many different ideas and concepts he explored that you'll have a fun time diving deep into it if you like experimental stuff that's really, really weird. So, the most famous of his works, arguably, is what we're going to be looking at today, the project titled I Am Sitting in a Room. There's many different versions of this. There's the live performances he's done that go back as far as the 60s, I believe, or the late 60s, and then followed them all the way up into the 2000s, and there's numerous different recordings of it, looking at the 1981 recording of this. And so the process is always the same for I Am Sitting in the Room. It involves Lucier recording himself narrating his text, simply speaking it out, playing the tape recorder back into the room, then re-recording it, and then repeating the process over and over and over again. And what ends up happening is really quite fascinating, I find. It's due to the room's size and geometry, basically, certain frequencies in the recording become emphasized and others become dampened, basically. It brings different things out and quietens different things. And so what starts off as very legible, understandable speech, spoken word, turns into this really, really weird drone piece of frequencies. And they're all the natural resonant frequencies of the room that Lucier's in. And it's one of those ideas, one of those experiments. It's very simple on paper, but the result of it is something completely incredible, different, and it's very unique to behold. Like, I'm always sort of just like amazed by the scope of this project for some reason. It starts off as spoken word, Lucia just reading his text, simply speaking to us, and then it just turns into this miasma of really weird frequencies that sound absolutely nothing like what it originated from. It's so peculiar. And yeah, for me, like, I find there to be something so incredibly engrossing about this whole project. It takes repetition. Something we find a lot in Drone, but it takes repetition to this very weird place that few other projects have done really. Because as the piece develops, you've got that spoken word, but it sounds like it's slowly melting and degrading and just turning into goop, I guess. I would say it's kind of like a photograph again. I know I compared another thing to photographs in another video. I think it was the last one actually. Regardless, it's like a photograph that's gotten bleached by the sun, right? You've got the photo there, you could see everything in it, and then as time goes on, it just obliterates the entire image, and you can't see it anymore. And it's kind of like what's happening here. You've got the original text, you've got the original version of the audio, what he's saying, and then that just gets completely obliterated by the end of the whole project, basically. Very peculiar stuff. And what's very, very quaint and human about the whole project as well is Lucier's intention behind it, which, if you listen to "I Am Sitting in a Room," you'll understand. He tells us literally why he's doing this. And he explains that it's less of a demonstration of the physical fact of how a room's natural resonant frequencies will pick apart the speech and highlight certain elements, but it's, I think, to put it bluntly, it's more of a method to solve his own issues with his stutter. You can hear it in the initial recording. Bless him, he speaks with a stutter, and he's using this experiment as a way to solve his speech impediment, I guess. And with that in mind, it gives the project this incredibly lovely context. It's kind of sad, but also really sweet at the same time, and very relatable and human. And the wonderful thing is that it does work, because by the end of the whole thing, by the time you get to that last rotation, there's no instance of stuttering whatsoever. Like, you can't tell there's anything, because it doesn't sound like speech anymore, does it? Although this is an experimental album that involves spoken word and something known as process, a genre called process, which is a very fascinating genre to dive into, there is still this very weird musical element to the album, especially like by the time you get to the halfway point. So the album, in this particular version, I think there's around 32 or 36 repetitions of the piece. And it starts off with spoken word, and then it slowly just becomes like less and less of that. And by the end, there's no spoken word left. You just have these weird auditory blobs of sort of musical thing. And the really weird part is, by this point, it starts to present its own natural tune, its own natural melody almost. That's this melody that's hidden deep within the original speech. And in how Lucia actually spoke the original words in the first version of the text, the first version of the recording, basically, in the one you're hearing, whichever one you hear. Very weird, very bizarre. And it just keeps on growing and growing and growing until by the end you just have this full-on drone of pulsating textures. And it's so peculiar because it's taking the destruction and reduction of something, and in the process of doing so, turning it into something much bigger and grander than it was in the beginning. And yeah, it's arguably not for everybody. It's very peculiar, and not everybody wants to sit down and listen to a recording of a man saying, "I am sitting in a room," around 40 odd times, right? But I just find there's something truly fascinating about this experiment and the process that it makes it a really, really engrossing listen for anybody who's into experimental music or just experimental projects in general, especially sound art. It's truly fascinating. Like, it blows my mind every time. And alongside this, Lucier's body of work, incredibly fascinating stuff. Like you go to the beginning of his work back in the '60s up to the more modern times, and it shows the journey of this man who had trouble with communication in his early years. I think at least this is how I interpret it. Like, his stutter made it very difficult for him to communicate to people, and he discovered his own way of doing so through the world of experimentation and process. And since his passing away last year in 2021, we've been left with a plethora of experimental processes that really push the boundary of sound production and presentation. And it takes seemingly simple ideas, but he executes them with such brilliant precision. Like, it's a fascinating body of work to delve into. And what's wonderful is that in 2012 they made a wonderful documentary called No Ideas But in Things, which basically an entire documentary about Alvin Lucier and his entire body of work. So if you're intrigued, definitely go check that one out, because it is a fascinating documentary that the really fun part as well, it takes the I am sitting in a room concept as a framing device for the documentary, which is very interesting. But it also goes into many of his other works as well, like Music on a Long Thin Wire, solo performer, performance for solo performers, something like that. I should look into it, basically. But yeah, like, fascinating body of work that's definitely worth jumping into. Like, it's mind-boggling. Simple, but effective. And with that, I think we're going to conclude our episode today of Weird Music. It's arguably, for me, one of the most important experimental albums to come out in history. It's so unique, so different, so wonderful, and thus perfect candidate to talk about on Weird Music, right? And I do truly count myself as a fan of Lucier's work, and even with that being said, there's still so much more I need to explore with him. And with that, I do hope you've enjoyed the episode today. Like, I'm really glad we've had a chance to discuss Lucier and his work. Since his passing last year, I think it's important to keep the memory going. Like his body of work will, far live beyond him. It's a beautiful thing, really. But for now, I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
Somebody said my music is about revealing sounds that are always there, but you've never heard them exactly. I am sitting in a room, the same one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I'm going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed.